David, as you know, is in many people's minds the person who is associated, of course, with ACF and very well known to all of you. And I know that you all look forward to hearing him, so I will pass on to him in just a moment. But I want you to join in me in giving him a very warm welcome to the stage, because I think we need to recognise his huge contribution over the last 14 years, and also to show to him the great respect and affection within which we hold him. So can I invite our CEO, David Emerson, CBE, to come to the platform.
Amanda surprised me last year and she surprised me again. Welcome from across the UK, from the diversity of foundations. Welcome to this unique event for independent funders. And it is and has been the success it is because of you, because of what each of you bring to it, and as well as what you will gain from others. So thank you for your commitment, for the travel many of you have made, for the time you've given up to be here, and thereby for making it the great event it will be. I'd like to follow that with my personal thanks to the wonderful and supportive ACF staff team who once again have owned this event and have been so dedicated in their preparation, led by Esther Thompson in the front row, who's done a wonderful job, but also with immense support from Natasha, Stephanie, Andrea and Vicky. Thanks to all of them. Carol and I are deeply appreciative because this is a huge logistical exercise and it flows only because of their commitment and dedication. I'd also like to thank very much Kieran and Richard for the intellectual input which follows behind what I'll be saying in a few minutes. But once again, unfortunately, I now have my regular task of passing on the apologies of the Civil Society Minister, Rob Wilson, but this year, as Amanda hinted, with a twist. Having turned down our invitation in April, he then asked us in August if he could give the keynote speech today. But unfortunately, he now has pressing parliamentary business. Last year, I used his apology as a link into my then theme of independence. This year, I shall, of course, make no such link to our theme of trust. So, everybody here today, everyone who is engaged directly with the work of the Foundation has been entrusted. But with what? Well, first and foremost with a charitable mission, and secondly, with the resources with which to carry it out. So, what does it mean to be entrusted, to have trust placed in you? For trust to be core to everything you do? Well, that is what we're here today to reflect upon, to think about the implications for how we work, and in particular for how we work now. I'd like to argue that being a charitable trust, being a trustee, and being entrusted are not simply quaint, old-fashioned terms, but instead are vital clues. Clues which carry echoes of how we might contribute to today's society, far beyond simply the money that we bring. So let me start by asking, what do we know about trust as it relates to our work? And our distinguished guests will be considering trust in other ways and further. Well, at its most personal, it means we can rely on someone, that we understand one another, that we can count on one another to act honourably, that we can share vulnerability, and we can be honest in our emotions and actions without fear of judgment. We also know, of course, that trust operates beyond the realm of family, partner and friend. it shapes the dynamics of our social interactions too. Well, people talk about brands, from washing up liquid, trusting brands, washing up liquid in public services. Commentators talk about civic trust, whether we trust government, media, or other institutions. And recently, and perhaps increasingly, people talk about charities. Do the public trust us? With that in mind, a number of questions follow. How do we retain and strengthen trust? How does it inform our work with those we fund, with other stakeholders in civil society and beyond? How might we hold, harness, and deploy trust to improve our effectiveness in delivering our objectives? What inherent risks are there to a trust-based approach, and how might they be mitigated? But especially, how do we build trust, what threatens it, and how is it eroded? And it is fitting that we ask these questions here in the context of ACF's annual conference. Each year, this is a chance for us to come together as funders, peers, colleagues, friends, to share learning, to discuss challenges, to focus our thinking around a particular issue. But could we do those things without trust? I'm doubtful. So here today, in microcosm, we can see and experience the crucial role that trust plays in building relationships, in allowing for mutual exchange, and in learning from one another's failures as well as from our successes. Trust is the key condition for productive challenge. I would also argue that there has never been a more important time to address the issue of trust. Because today, more so than at any time in recent memory, our discussion is set within a context of social and political turbulence. To take one all too obvious example, let us return to June's referendum. The result arguably raised more questions than it gave answers, and especially for those individuals, institutions, structures that might be said collectively to make up the establishment. It's become very clear that one of the central themes dominating public discourse was trust, or more accurately, the lack of trust. We were told that we were living in a time of profound distrust of elites, of experts, of expertise, of distrust between communities, between generations, between nations, and between supranational bodies, the institutions, and the treaties that come with them. Putting opinions of the result aside, I believe that all of us must engage with what the referendum has revealed about our society and exactly how those revelations may shape our future. This arc of distrust may well be long and have deep and tangled roots, but for many of you, foundations, the current circumstances, I suspect, leave you feeling compelled to look again at how you might work to alter its trajectory. I'm hearing foundations who are working with localities, asking themselves how they can do more to build trust between communities, between generations. And if you or they have been funding leadership, asking, is it appropriate leadership for tomorrow? Because the way that trust is built is changing too. More and more, we live in a society that is building its networks of trusts selectively, drawing on the lived experiences of others and sharing it openly and at speed. After all, how many of us now filter our news online via social media or value online reviews over corporate advertising? But my time at ACF has taught me that in changing and in challenging times, just such as these, you, foundations, inevitably respond with creativity and with energy in the service of your beneficiaries. And I believe, I know, that the funders can make a difference. By leveraging a role as facilitators, conveners, communicators, you can begin to establish a genuinely collaborative discourse around social change, so that when funding a program, a grant, a social investment, We can ask, how aware are we of its potential inadvertently to encourage division? Or, have we now a greater responsibility to consider how our support can help empower communities? Or build democratic engagement? Or forge meaningful links between the private, the public and voluntary community sectors? And are we being attentive to the ongoing leadership and capacity needs of marginalised groups, whether that be in terms of gender, sexuality, ethnicity or class? And all of these are questions that will be addressed through today's range of workshops and plenaries, but I mention them because they convey a flavour of what we've been hearing, the discussions that we've been privy to in ACF over the past few months. And there are just two other aspects of trust that I'd like to touch briefly on before I close. These are complexity and intentionality. What I've just been describing is the fact that our already complicated world has just gotten a whole lot more complex. And what does that mean if you're a trustee charged with delivering a charitable mission, or a grant maker involved in establishing and nurturing a partnership? I'd argue that collectively it means that we must do more than simply hold steady in the face of changing winds, do more than simply press forward as the waves rise. Now is the time to be versatile, to be agile, to bend often rather than risking a break. We must continue to think not only about what we fund, but also how we fund, and this means we must trust. And that brings me to intentionality. We don't trust blindly. We are well aware that to trust is to choose, that we must bring our expertise and discretion to every partnership, and that we continue to share responsibility for trust throughout its lifetime. But still, we must trust. Because we are at our best when we are prepared to give up control. And in doing so, set free those we fund to adapt, to innovate in the face of rapid change. We have been entrusted, yes, but we must ask ourselves whether we are passing that gift on. Are we entrusting others in turn? Because at their best, our relationships work when both parties trust the other to deliver, when both trust the other to be honest about their aims and needs, when both trust in the intentions and spirit of the partnership, and ultimately, when both trust in the engagement as a vehicle for social good. Yes, we continue to measure the distance travelled. Yes, we continue to analyse. Yes, we continue to get smarter about how we use technology and data to drive decisions and make it an impact. But we always resist doing this at the expense of our two greatest assets: the ability to trust and our liberty to put people at the heart of all that we do. Our ability to trust and putting people at the heart of all that we do. So for me, then, there is a case of being even more intentional about the way we build and maintain this trust. It is also a verb. It is something we actively do. It is something we preserve, maintain, and renew. However, just at the moment that I'm encouraging you to seek and build trust more, we are all well aware that the public is trusting us and charities less. So we must remain aware of the wider forces at play in society at large. Transparency is an increasing expectation, and I suspect Baroness O'Neill will offer us some thoughts on that in a moment. And we operate within a sector that relies on its integrity and reputation to justify the particular position it has in law. I believe that we as foundations have a part to play in maintaining public trust in what charities do, and that we must also be aware that while trust makes us resilient, it also makes us vulnerable. While trust can take decades to build, it can take only moments to undermine or destroy, so that striking a balance is key. For the long-term health of the sector, trustees need to be confident in maintaining ultimate accountability, first and foremost, to their charitable objectives, and not to be overly inhibited by the climate of the day or perceived fluctuations in public opinion. That is our collective act of safeguarding. And we at ACF, in turn, continue to work with you to defend and enhance an operating environment which is trusting, trusted, and enabling at its core. We must be confident in our ability to back less popular, controversial, or neglected causes. That is, those vital organisations and individuals who we all know would otherwise struggle to find the support they need. But over the years that I've worked with yourselves, foundations, I've always had the sense that we have had people and relationships at the heart of our collective vision. And I strongly believe that this will serve us well in the coming years and decades. For it is our collective ability to trust consciously, to trust deliberately, that is more necessary now than it has been at any time or any point in my working memory. And all of which leads me back here to this hall today, looking out at yourselves, the 350 members in attendance from across the whole of the UK and from all shapes and sizes. If you didn't know before, and as you've just learned, this will be my last conference as Chief Executive. And looking back over 14 years fills me with enormous emotion. But more than anything, it fills me with great pride and great gratitude. It has been an immense privilege to serve a group of funders. Different and diverse, oh my goodness, how diverse you are. But connected at root by a deep determination to be a force for good in society. And during my period in office, the challenges that our society faces have multiplied. But with each new challenge, I remain awed by your collective ability to back what's needed, to preserve what's under threat, to take the long view, but specifically to give consistent support, your consistent support, to society's change makers. And throughout all of this, you have trusted me, and most especially you have trusted ACF. And it is that trust that has allowed us to develop and to improve year on year in support of you, our members. And I know that it will be that ongoing trust, your ongoing trust, that will fuel, sustain and inspire ACF in the years to come. No amount of thanks could do justice to the support and confidence you have shown in myself and in the committed and astounding ACF team of whom I am so very proud. So I will just say a simple but heartfelt thank you. Have a great, great conference.
So as has already been indicated, now is a very good time to be talking about trust. There's the notion of a post-truth society that's been floating around. And in my day job, I run the Royal Statistical Society, and so I'm confronted with the misuse of statistics, figures and evidence in daily life. Most recently in the EU referendum campaign, which was talked about earlier, both sides were misusing evidence, although probably most emblematic was what was written on the side of a big red bus. But are we really in a post-truth age? Was there some golden truth age before this? I don't really quite buy that. And if there is a lack of trust in institutions, perhaps the public is rational to be so. Just yesterday we were hearing again about the Chilcot inquiry into the inner workings of government around the Iraq war, and that was a clear failure of government. And so perhaps a lack of trust is actually a rational response in those circumstances. turning to the charitable sector, which David just mentioned, Tim Harford, the well-known journalist, talks about the rise of statistical bullshit. And he says charities are perhaps the worst offenders in this area. One example he gave was of Guide Dogs UK. They did a survey, just an online survey, which always gives you a biased response, asking their guide dog owners if they'd had any accidents with cyclists. And that was then reported as saying 25% of guide dog owners in London have had accidents with cyclists. Within the 24 hours, they had to withdraw what they'd said because the poll was so wrong. But there are many other examples, and you will be all familiar with those, because of the pressures to use data to get a headline rather than actually cast light on the problem. So what can foundations do? There are many institutions and charities out there trying to use data and evidence in a more effective way to actually cast light and to give truth. And foundations could play a role in supporting those. So, for example, the Nuffield Foundation has been a big supporter. In the last election, they were funding the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which we all turn to for some kind of guidance on what the economic facts are. They're also funding Full Fact, which is a fact-checking charity, actually analysing the claims that are made in public life and whether they're true or not. The Big Lottery has funded the What Works Centres, which are looking at actually bringing together academics and policymakers to say what might actually work when there's a policy issue, which has come to light. I'll introduce our speakers in a minute, but in a sense, all of them have had some links to the things that I've been talking about. So we have an excellent panel to discuss the issue of trust. Baroness Honora O'Neill, a philosopher, crossbench peer, until recently chair of Equality and Human Rights Commission, and also a former chair of the Nuffield Foundation, which I've just mentioned. Dawn Ostwick, who's chief exec of the Big Lottery Foundation Fund, and again, I've just mentioned the way that they've been funding things like the What Works Centre and also the Alliance for Useful Evidence as well. And Honor Rhodes, Director of Strategic Development at Tavistock Relationships, and one of the original founders of the Early Intervention Foundation, which is one of these What Works Centres. So, without further ado, Honora, give us your views.
Hayden, thank you very much. Do we always want more trust? I think that's a useful, slightly sceptical question. And I just remember the well-known Mr. Madoff, who made off with lots of people's money. It wouldn't have been a good thing if there'd been more trust in said Mr. Madoff. But it would, of course, have been a very good thing if he had been more trustworthy and had stolen less. So I think the fundamental thing we have to think about is trustworthiness rather than trust. That's because we can't place and refuse trust intelligently unless we can track trustworthiness. I don't mean complete trustworthiness, but adequate trustworthiness for the purpose. And that means asking, as you all know, discriminating questions about what someone was doing. What are they trustworthy for? Why do we have an interest in working out whether to place or refuse trust in them? And when we ask what are they trustworthy for, of course it's very, very diverse. One doesn't trust everybody for everything. That is what we call blind trust, not a good idea. So intelligent trust, well-placed trust, it seems to me has to focus on at least three questions. What one is trying to get a handle on is, first of all, the honesty of the other party. Honesty, simple, well-known. Do they say what they mean, and do they do what they say? Two very simple questions. The second thing one wants to get a handle on is, are they competent? Both dishonesty and incompetence are very destructive of trust. Dishonesty for the obvious reasons, but incompetence is also very destructive. And finally, I would add reliability, because I think it's very important that honesty and competence aren't exercised solely for special occasions, but routinely, reliably, all the time. Now, if an institution or person is honest, competent, and reliable in the relevant respects, and we can judge it, we have no difficulty in placing and refusing trust intelligently. But problem, you will immediately say, is we can't always judge this. How can we tell? Particularly where matters are very complex. It's one thing when you're thinking about the corner store and you can trust them to have fresh milk because, first of all, you know what fresh milk is like. I've gone silent, haven't I?
You're back.
You're back.
I'm back, okay. You know what fresh milk tastes like. You know where you bought it and so on. You can judge the matter. But we're talking about very complicated institutions in many cases, very complicated professions. So the second thing that we need to do if we seek to be trusted is to make the evidence clear and accessible to others. That's a great task. I think at no time more important than now. Heaton has mentioned some of the things he's involved in and some of the other charities that are doing something about it. I'd add to the list Sense About Science and Evidence Matters, closely linked, which are trying to communicate the evidence to the wider public. But I think that's a task for all of us. If you want to be trusted, communicate the evidence that you are trustworthy, and then other people can judge and place their trust accordingly. Thank you.
Dawn.
Thank you very much. And I'd love to have a conversation about the Tim Harford view, because I was on the panel that night and I had a rather different perspective, but we can come on to that later perhaps. I'm going to start with Thomas Jefferson. Quote, "Sometimes it is said that man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the form of kings to govern him? Let history answer this question." And the reason why I rather liked that quote, because it seemed to me it went to the heart of the matter, which is really where David was in his speech, was it's all about people, stupid. That's where we have to start, and that's where we have to end. And have we got a loss of trust? I'm not sure. That's a sort of absolute statement. I do sense that there is a dislocation between people and institutions that might be manifested in a loss of trust, and it may be to a greater or lesser extent in different circumstances. But that seems to me to be the core of the problem, that we have lost ourselves in the equation. I went to see the Ken Loach film, I, Daniel Blake, and there's a great piece of script writing. I have no idea whether this is fiction or fact, but repeatedly in the film there's a reference to the decision maker, which the benefits officers say, we can't resolve your case until you have spoken to the decision maker. And throughout the film one feels one's in a sort of dystopian future that one can't quite believe really exists, because the decision maker is an abstract of something that is ultimately a human choice, a human decision. So I think we are in a world of done to rather than owned by, and that people have in some senses become the cogs in someone else's wheel, and often an institutional wheel, and that it's in those institutional relationships that we have a lot of our problems. And those of us, of course, who are in the sort of business of social change and enabling people to live good lives and communities to thrive, that's quite a profound challenge for us in the way in which we work. I was very struck after the 2011 riots. At that point I was at Esme Fairbairn, and we asked the wonderful Ruth Ibegbuna to come and talk to our board. She runs a charity in Manchester called Reclaim, and to talk about the impact of the riots on the folk that she worked with, young people, relatively disadvantaged backgrounds in Manchester. And she said what was extraordinary about what happened afterwards is all the authorities ran around having meetings, going to the places where the riots were, gathering people to come and talk. But all the people that were at that table were the institutions, the representatives, the authorities. The people who weren't at that table were the young people. And yet, actually, it was their table that everyone else was sitting at. And I thought that was a really profound observation on her part. That's a sort of general observation. What about funders specifically? It seems to me we have got a number of issues to grapple with. And the first I would call the problem of the four-box model, which is that our institutional frameworks, our ways of thinking, have in some ways become dominated by the frameworks of what I would call technocracy. We've become very concerned quite often, particularly in public institutions, with issues about accountability, transparency, risk. What are those things there for? I think that they have increasingly become mechanisms to defend ourselves against blame for an action that we may have taken, rather than enabling mechanisms to help us achieve our ambitions. And the parallel I would draw is, a very long time ago, I was the project director for Tate Modern, and there came a point in that project where we needed to sign the construction contracts, but we hadn't raised all the money to do so. And therefore, we had to take a risk. And that was a risk that had to be shared collectively by the institution, the trustees, by government, and by the funders, or the key funder, who at that point was the Millennium Commission. An act of faith based on judgment was taken by 3 individuals in senior positions in those institutions to say that the contract could be let, the project could proceed. You are probably all sitting here thinking, well, it was blindingly obvious it was going to be a massive success and it was all going to come in on time, on budget. In 1997, let me tell you, a number of people in this country and internationally thought the Tate was insane to take on Tate Modern. So it looks like it was simple. It required courage, expertise, and a true sense of understanding about what accountability and risk are in order to do that. I've often wondered if we were replaying that now, would we still make the same decision? I don't know. I'm not sure whether our frameworks and our mechanisms have actually restricted our capacity to breathe in that sense. I think as funders we have also, some of us, these are personal opinions, perhaps accreted to ourselves not just the act of funding and of supporting, but the act of analysis, diagnosis, solutions development, and strategic action and intervention. And in so doing, we run the risk of reducing the practitioner, who I would argue holds a lot of the expertise and the networks, to, at worst, bid writer, monitoring reporter, and delivery agent, rather than social entrepreneur, movement leader, and transformer of lives. And of course, it's quite fun to do all those things, but where are we in the food chain? What should we be offering? What do we do about this? I think we take a deep breath. We take courage. I think perhaps we need to adopt a little bit of the Ronald Reagan School of Management, which is go to the golf course more often and get out of the way. I think George Bush was similar. It'd be interesting to see what happens next week, but we won't go there. And actually really understand what our collective role is as leaders, and as leaders in an ecology and not a machine bureaucracy. And I think that it requires an act of generosity on all our parts to recognise that we are but one part of that ecology. The way in which we can most effectively fulfil our role is to understand the interrelationships between what we do and what others do. And in so doing, I think I would say we fulfil or we consider, and I will end with John Donne, and I'm sorry that both my quotes are about men. No man is an island entire of himself. And I think that to me, thinking about how we develop trust is absolutely about understanding our role in that complex ecology. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn, and we're trusting you not to tweet out that the chief of the big lottery is saying, go to the golf course more often.
Oh, no, I've said it before, it's all right.
Very good. Honor.
I'm quite small, and I come from the Tavistock Relationships organisation, which is that if there's ever a lectern, you should stand behind it, so I am. I was absolutely absolutely enchanted. I think there's no other word for it to be asked to think about trust and what that means and I'm going to use the word, it's a scary one, from a psychoanalytic perspective, because I reckoned it wouldn't be often that you get to hear those sorts of ideas, unless, of course, many of you in this room are also secret psychotherapists, which actually I know that some of you are. So it was always hard for me to decide where to start on a subject as large and as emotionally charged as trust. But then I decided we should all start at the beginning, which was with the tiny infant, scarcely able to control her limbs or focus her eyes. She's driven by an urgent need to survive, and for that to happen, she needs to have all those things at the very bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs fulfilled. She needs to be fed, she needs to be kept warm and protected from saber-toothed tigers. She must, though, like all of us, strive to exist, which means that she needs to be kept emotionally secure, contained, and she needs, ideally, to be unequivocally loved. So the infant isn't born with a trusting state of mind. Trust is something we learn. We trust as it allows us to sustain ourselves when our needs are not met instantly, or those who care for us are absent from us. Trust allows us to believe, as a conjecture about the future, that we will be attended to and comforted and restored, just not quite now. So trust and hope are two companions. In ideal circumstances, the infant grows and develops a strong sense of herself. Her parents or carers will be what Donald Winnicott, the very famous paediatrician and child psychoanalyst, called good enough at what they do. Good enough sounds like a low bar. What happened to perfect? Winnicott counselled against perfection, and I have to say in the dark days of being a parent myself, it was a great comfort. A good enough mother allows herself to be used by the infant so that he or she may naturally develop a healthy sense of omnipotence, which will naturally be frustrated as the child matures. This is all to the good. So what Winnicott is suggesting helpfully is that it is our duty as parents to slowly and surely disappoint our children. As I say, it is a great comfort. We must do so knowingly. We must say no, and we must contend with the idea that we are not our child's friend. They will probably have enough of those. We are something unique and utterly special, a parent with authority to use wisely. If we don't help our children to manage disappointment, then the adult world will be a constantly shocking place until the child, as an adult, learns to self-manage. This is a much harder task in adulthood, and it's not a state of mind conducive to warm, lasting friendships and intimate relationships. This focus on the small child may seem remote from our adult relationships, but it is the pattern for them. Most of us will have had good enough parenting most of the time and grow up with a sense of proportionate entitlement. If we've had insufficient care and insufficient unequivocal love, we may carry a burden of unworthiness into our careers and maturity. But if all our needs have been met before we can fully experience and manage the frustration of being denied, we can become overweening in our sense that the world should bend to our will. Some children have been bitterly disappointed in childhood and carry those emotional scars with them into their world and their work. We also know that deeply pessimistic people may be temperamentally created, but other children in a family may have had the same degree of loss, but are somehow protected from some of its worst consequences because they've had another relationship in which they trust that has acted as a degree of protection for them, a teacher, another member of the extended family. The pattern of our early lives colours our expectations then. It will form our responses and relationships. It will predict our capacity to tolerate new ideas, challenging situations, conflict, unreasonable demands of others. It may well orient us in our careers. Many firstborns with high trust values are found in the helping professions. Is that you? A few. Bang goes the data. What happens, though, when a trusting child meets their first observable lie or some other attack that can only be experienced as an attack on trust? Think back to a time in your own childhood when you felt a small stab of betrayal. The friend who promised to sit beside you and then with a smile slips into a seat next to someone else. For children, these acts of betrayal are scalding. They're often at the heart of the cry, it's not fair. It's not fair to have something you trust denied to you. And no adult response can ever really mend the hurt. Even if the adult arbiter agrees with us, they cannot make the desirable thing happen. It wasn't the toy we really wanted. It was to have the toy and to play with our sister. Often in life we learn we can have one, but not the other. Small acts of betrayal we can learn to manage, and in truth we embark on a life of carrying them out on others, all the while knowing how much they can hurt. Larger acts of betrayal are far more complicated, and sometimes in our intimate relationships, it's not our partner's actual sexual infidelity that so attacks us and smashes through our view of ourselves and our world, but the smaller breaches of trust along the way. The missing a birthday party with a lie, misusing family money, lying to the children about being away from home. These are things that are stored up in the list of acts of betrayal. They must be examined and weighed and examined again, and painfully we can restore ourselves and our relationship if we have a mind to. The relationship therapist, though, is very like the parent who cannot give us both things we desire. Many people whose partners have betrayed their trust want both the deepest, most sincere and humbling of apologies and for things to be the way they were. It's disconcerting in relationship therapy, though, to find that the therapist will refuse to take my side against my philandering partner. She refuses to punish him. She listens intently to what he has to say, even though he says things that are attacking of me. It's not fair. And for the couple, they have to learn that it is the relationship between them that is the patient under consideration here. There is no Wimbledon umpiring with minutes for us each to talk. Until the couple can understand that the rope of relationship that has bound them together is what is important, and how each of them must hold their end firm, then repairing the fraying middle or the giant knot isn't possible. For those of you who are interested to think more about this, then you need to come and train as relationship counsellors. For the very few of you for whom this doesn't appeal, I will post a link to the trust measure devised by John Gottman, and you can all have a look. And so it is in the organisations we work in and connect with. Organisations are only made up of people, after all, and all these people have been tiny infants once, managing and not managing disappointments, fear of abandonment and rage. We are each offering the ends of ropes to each other, tangling and unwinding, pulling or leaving slack, trusting and liking, disliking and betraying as we go. We remain in our heart of hearts, rather small and really rather needy children. And so we must be careful and kind about how we go about our business.
So you've had a rich and wide range of stimulus to get you going on the theme of trust. What I'd like to do now is ask you to spend 5 minutes talking to your neighbour, introduce yourself, and just have a chat about what the panel has sort of stimulated in your own mind, and in particular the implications for foundations. Over to you. Right, can I bring you back to order now, please? I know it's the most fun part of the day. Thank you very much. We've now got about 20 minutes for questions to the panel. So what I'll do is take sort of batches of 3 or 4, and then the panel can pick up those bits that are sort of pertinent to them. So over to you. I've got 1, 2, 3. So let's do those. So you over there? The mic, there should be a mic coming around. If we've got a second mic, if we could bring it to the front here.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yep. Hi, my name's Jan Dool from the Tushen Foundation. We've just had a very interesting discussion here about trusting in a situation where the balance of power is not even. So as funders, we have a lot of power. And we would be interested in the panel's comments around trust in that kind of environment where one of the parties has most of the power.
Okay, thank you very much. And then we've got somebody up here. And then if you could pass the mic back to the third person. Great.
Trust. Picking up on Baroness O'Neill's emphasis on trustworthiness, I am interested in the panel's advice. where you suspect dishonesty or more especially incompetence, what do you do about it?
Wouldn't.
What is your advice?
Okay. And can you just say who you are?
I did say,
Sorry.
actually. Kevin Sugru, Local Trust.
Great, thank you very much. And then we've got somebody at the back. Yep.
Richard Jenkins, ACF staff. I'm really struck by the fact that a lot of the organisations here today are meeting the needs, or attempting to, of people that have suffered catastrophic failures in their early development. And a lot of the needs that people are trying to address, drug abuse, unemployment, family breakdown, etc., stem back to the kind of failures you're talking about, Honor. But then as funders, how do they respond given the finite resources that funders have? I think in most of the interactions that funders have with their applicants, there's more disappointment than there is fulfillment. So how do funders be good enough funders?
Great, thank you. So we've got a question about power imbalances, something about what do you do when you suspect dishonesty or incompetence, and how to be a good funder given the finite resources. Honor, do you want to kick off and we'll move down?
Oh, what wonderful questions. And I think the couple relationship is at the heart of all of them, actually. I think that notion that from Jan about how we manage the imbalance of power is really important. And that's like any relationship. Most relationships have a power imbalance in them somewhere. Very few are equal and stand on equal footings. But all I would suggest is that we consider the worst forms of imbalance of power are found in profoundly abusive relationships. It would be a very poor trust or foundation that engaged in abusive relationships. And I think the truth is about acknowledgement. I think there are things that you are all thinking about co-design, but ultimately you are the parent with the power to say no. And that is your responsibility and it is your authority. And I think that there's just some thinking that needs to be wrapped around that. But I think it is a real challenge. I think that where we encounter things that make us alarmed about the capacity of an applicant to be entirely trustworthy, I think that we need to call it out. Because I think we do that in our human relationships. And one of the ways we do that is just to avoid, which means that you resolve the problem temporarily and now for you, but that behaviour goes on in other places unchallenged. And one of the things we do as responsible civic citizens is to disrupt behaviours that are difficult. So I think we have to say, do you know, at the moment I'm not full of confidence that you will give me what I need. Should I be giving you the money that you're asking for? So I think there's something about trust that can only relate to how you feel inside. And I would say that. I come from a psychoanalytically driven organisation, but there is an internal working model that you have about what good and good recipients is like. But the catastrophic failures point and how to be a good enough funder, I think, must surely be at the heart of everything you do, because you are ultimately both givers and deniers. And I think that you have to feel equally comfortable with both of those things. A good parent is one that accepts the authority that they have. There's this notion of authoritative parent. It's not the authoritarian parent who dictates to their child everything that they must do and they must feel, and it is not the lax and permissive parent who allows the child to do anything they want. It is that middle path. So there's something about embracing the power to say no, to think about how your no will be understood and received, but to ultimately accept that your no will be as carefully crafted as you can manage it with the resources that you have, which may be very little, and the no will be heard, listened and understood by the other party, perhaps in a completely different way. And I don't think there's very much you can do about that. So I think for you, the counsel of perfection is one that you should swiftly put aside. Release yourself from that notion and just hold to being good enough.
Thank you.
I think that's great advice. Trust in power relationships. So I'm going to slightly disagree with Honor, because the assumption behind that is because you have money, you have power. And I think we have all collectively colluded in creating a society that holds that up as a truth. However, When I was on the other side of the fence as a practitioner, I didn't think that the funders had the power. I thought that I was in an organisation that actually was forging its own destiny, and I wanted the funders to join my party or our party, because actually we were actually the ones who were doing the work and changing the world in whatever way it was that we thought we wanted to do, and that funders and money was there to oil those wheels. I think one of the difficulties is that sense of confidence has been eroded over a number of years in our overall way of thinking about the ecology that we work in. So I think we need to do some work as funders to recalibrate that. And part of it is actually not treated as an elephant in the room, which is what happens too often. And also, can we just get over ourselves? We have the money. Doesn't mean we have the wisdom. Doesn't mean we have the networks. Doesn't mean we have the practice. So actually, we have some sort of power, but it's absolutely not absolute. What do you do with incompetence and dishonesty? Well, if you're dealing with dishonesty, you surely have an ethical framework which will guide you in your choices, it would seem to me. And sometimes that is an absolute and binary set of choices that one makes. Incompetence seems to me to be more complicated because people may be incompetent for all sorts of other complicated reasons where you may be able to help. And it would seem to me that that is the path that you take around incompetence. And so I would navigate those two slightly differently. That's a very shorthand answer, I appreciate. Richard's point about people suffering catastrophic failures, I would go back to the done to or owned by. Some of the most impressive individuals I've met in my entire life are people who have lived lives of exactly those sorts of catastrophic failures, often people with multiple and complex needs. What they have managed to achieve with their lives, often absolutely without help from the rest of us, is remarkable, and I completely take my hat off to them. So I think when we as funders are thinking about how we do good, I think we should listen more, we should support more, we should enable more, and we should absolutely ensure that those folk are in many ways in the driving seat, and that they're in the driving seat with practitioners as well as with funders sitting behind the practitioners.
Okay.
I think I'll say something about the boring end of this. The boring end is that as funders, you are subject to, and quite properly, to pretty stringent forms of accountability and pretty stringent disciplines of how you do certain things. And I needn't elaborate. That means that, in a sense, one's focus is very much on meeting those standards, and they aren't always the right standards, and they can get in the way of the other things and of the sorts of relationships that one wants. So one thing I think one needs to be clear about is there's an awful lot of stupid accountability out there. I'm dead keen on accountability, but it has to be intelligent accountability, and it's a struggle for all of us to try to make these systems of accountability better. One system that I have particular worries about is the blithe way in which people say, oh, we need more transparency. Transparency is extremely good for a limited range of purposes. It is the answer to misplaced secrecy. Not, of course, to appropriate confidentiality and well-placed secrecy, but to misplaced secrecy, it's the answer. But truth to tell, what we often need is not transparency, but communication, because what is made available, oh, I put it on the website, you could look it up. It isn't found by the people who need it. It isn't intelligible to them if they find it. They can't see the context and so on. They don't have the time. They may not have the expertise. So I think we should try not to settle for transparency and try to communicate in relevant, intelligible, and corrigible ways, and best of all, two-way.
Thank you very much. We've got time for at least another round. I think probably just another round, given coffee is pressing on the other side. I've done this side of the room, you're done now. So questions from this side of the room. Let me give you guys a chance. So one here, lady in the red in the middle, and then gentleman in the blue at the back, and maybe a third.
Sian Edwards from Andrews Charitable Trust. Very interested to sort of reflect on what you've said about our place in the wider world, networks and power relationships. Dawn, from something you said, do you think we should possibly be less proactive than we've been as foundations and more reactive, giving the power and acknowledging the expertise of others?
Great, thank you. Could you pass the mic back 2 or 3 rows? There's somebody just behind you. Okay, and the gentleman in the blue.
Hi, I'm Stuart Gossock from the Wembley National Stadium Trust. I'm interested in the difference of trust perception between some of us in the room who will be associated with a well-known name or brand or something that brings an inherent trust with it. And because of that, folk out there may trust us implicitly, rightly or wrongly, or there may be some sort of reason behind why the funding is being put out there, which may or may not be trustworthy. But there may be others in the room who come from a more anonymous background and actually are maybe inherently much more trustworthy, but you actually have to start from a much lower base and build the trust within the community that you're looking to fund, and maybe where those two meet.
Great, thank you. Then.
I'm Cathy Farrow at Cass Business School and a trustee of the Barrow Cadbury Trust and author of some of the evidence that ACF has been publishing about foundations each year. And I was very pleased to hear Honora and Hitan in particular make reference to the evidence behind trustworthiness. As a researcher, I totally believe in evidence, and I'm known for being a bit of an evidence gatherer. But what I constantly find frustrating is that evidence doesn't always have the power that I think it should have. And I would really be quite interested in your comments on why evidence hasn't got as much power as we think it should have, and why we're in a post-truth society, people are really being very sceptical about expertise and what we can do about it.
Great, thank you very much. So we've got, should foundations be less proactive, and is that what you meant by the golf course idea? Brands carry trust or don't, and kind of how do we navigate that space? And then, in a sense, has the public really had enough of experts, as Michael Gove claimed? Okay, let's start with Honora and go the other way.
Okay, the public has not had enough of experts. It might have had enough of pseudo-experts. There is a difference. If I'm going to have my appendix out, I would sort of sooner the surgeon had done this stuff before. So expertise is not really the problem. It's the problem of trying to communicate using the wrong sort of expertise. I would say that it was a mistake of George Osborne to use financial models as a mode of public communication. Financial modelling is fine in its place, but you've got to understand the premises, or you don't understand how it works. So it was a lousy way of trying to communicate. Outright lies, like the money that would come to the health service, were an even worse way of communicating, but they may have reached. What we have to realise, I think, in this is that there is an entire industry that is, it's called PR, that is about getting messages across, not about getting accurate messages across. These are very different things, and we've got a huge problem. And I believe that we haven't begun to get to grips with the transformation of communication that social media have produced. To my mind, the most damaging effect is the rise of anonymous communication. I used to think, by the way, that it was the reliance on public opinion polls and survey evidence, which is weak evidence because, as you all know, subject to framing effects and lots of other difficulties, and also it only seeks to tap into generic opinions, attitudes, nothing to do with well-judged placing and refusal of trust. But I have to say, I've come to think that the thing we haven't got to grips with at all is the implications of mass anonymous communication, and let's be honest about it, miscommunication. And that's going to be extraordinarily difficult given our the new media that we have, where everybody can spread malicious gossip, even if they don't spread untruth. Do we want to live in a world where it is as though from behind every hedge in hiding, someone is throwing a stone at someone?
I'm not going to add very much to what Nora has said, other than I think evidence and expertise doesn't simply come in the form of data. I think it's much more complex. I think ethnography provides evidence, creativity provides evidence, relationships provide evidence, etc. So there's a great quote, the best experts have dirty feet. I rather like that. I'll focus on the question about the sort of role of the funder. I'm not saying that we abnegate all our responsibility and simply sort of stick a pin in a set of random applications. What I am saying is that we need to understand our role and where we can most add value. And when we move into space that others may occupy, we need to ask ourselves very seriously, are we the best player to be doing this? Are we most able to make the right choices? In our world as funders, what is the expertise that we bring? I think a lot of it is about funding judgments and about the choices you make, and that's where we should focus. We should learn to listen massively to what people therefore tell us. We should use evidence in all its forms, but we should use that to understand, in a generous leadership sense, our place in that overall ecology. And the further we move into other people's space, the more we displace them. And I think the question, therefore, is, in so doing, are we increasing the good that we want to achieve, or are we increasing our sphere of activity? And I just think we need to ask tough questions when we make those choices. I'm not saying you should never go there and be a sort of strategic philanthropist. That's probably very legitimate for some funders. But I think we just need to be very tough on ourselves, because the people that we fund won't be tough on us for all the reasons that we've talked about earlier.
I was just really interested in Stuart's question about the big brands, the Marmite, and the howls of protest that Marmite may, or we may be offered Vegemite. That was the thing that really upset most people, that this was a suitable alternative. I dislike both, so I'm really neutral about this. But I think that notion that big brands carry big trust, I don't know that I don't know that was your proposition, and if it is your proposition, then I disagree, because I think that just a bit like we can't trust an expert, I think we've become very sceptical about the big brands, particularly as supermarkets are offering us their essentials range. You can tell I shop at Waitrose. Which is the same thing, but in a plain packet, and it sort of carries out the same function. So I think the public are in a very difficult place. We are losing trust in things that would have supported us, church, faith, God, a country, and they're not behaving in the ways that we expect them to. And where do we then derive our sense of purpose and place? In whom shall we put our trust? And so we become, rather grudgingly, slightly more self-reliant. And to have to trust yourself is a very hard place to find yourself. And we're not, as Dawn said, an island. So we look around for other little islands and we form atolls and chains of islands. And we may all be wrong. This notion of the social media echo chamber, that is a very comfortable place to be, because I shout out something large and in capitals on Twitter and everybody goes, yes, and it gets retweeted and everybody goes, yes. And I can find myself in a position where I believe myself to have evidence that I am right. I'm evidence that I am right in the eyes of a very, very tiny section of society. And I think that we just need to help everybody pause, examine, but to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing. Because I think that is what is at the heart of all of this. Truly, we don't know much. And that is a very agonising condition to find ourselves in, and a very humbling one. But even if we don't know much, we know a little. And we know what might help most people in some circumstances. And we can have a good-hearted go at making it better. And we should be just as interested when things don't work. And we should be talking about those just as much as our sterling successes of changing the lives of people in Edale. And so I think that's our challenge. Our challenge is to be modest, moderate, good-hearted, trusting and faithful.
Great, well that's a wonderful note to end this morning session on. We've heard from Honor that it's about people, it's about relationships. We need to remember that we're children at heart and that we don't know that much, but we know something. We've heard from Dawn, I think, that we're in danger of perhaps becoming too technocratic. We mustn't be just covering our asses. That's my phrase, not hers. And are we recognising the expertise of those who have dirty feet? And we've heard from Honora that really it's about trustworthiness, not about trust. And we mustn't confuse transparency with communication. So I think that's been a rich feast for all of us this morning. Another rich feast awaits you downstairs in the coffee area now. So if you'll just join with me to thank our